May 23, 1967. Inside Cheyenne Mountain, the NORAD command post calls down to the weather desk with a strange question.
Is anything happening on the sun?
Yes, half the sun has blown away.
3 radars have already gone blind. The Ballistic Missile Early Warning System was America's tripwire. 3 radars. Clear, Alaska. Thule, Greenland. Fylingdales Moor, in Yorkshire. Together they gave the United States about 15 minutes of warning before Soviet warheads arrived. 15 minutes. That was the entire margin. And in 1967, interference on that system was not treated as a malfunction. Commanders viewed deliberate jamming as a potential act of war. 6 days earlier, a sunspot complex catalogued as McMath Region. 8818 had rotated onto the Earth-facing side of the Sun. Over the following 2 weeks, it produced 76 significant flares. On the afternoon of May 23rd, it produced 3 of them in close succession. At 6:40 p.m. Universal Time, the second flare became visible in ordinary white light for about 7 minutes. That almost never happens. To see a flare in plain visible light, the energy release has to be extraordinary, and the radio output was worse. At 606 MHz, observers recorded a burst of 373,000 solar flux units. It was the largest ever measured at that frequency. Another instrument, at 184 MHz, simply ran off the scale, which leaves the question that mattered inside Cheyenne Mountain that afternoon. How does a single event jam 3 separate radars on 3 separate continents within minutes of each other? Because in 1967, there was only one answer anyone had been trained to give. Everything in this video comes from published sources. A peer-reviewed study from 2016, co-written by the Air Force officers who were actually there, and the observatory records they filed at the time. No anonymous insiders, no mystery documents. If that's the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We publish one of these a week. 8 days before this happened, on May 15th, NORAD had formally accepted a major upgrade to the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System as fully operational. The most modern early warning network in the world was 8 days old, and it was about to be defeated by a sunset. Here is the geometry that nobody had accounted for. Late May, in the far north, the 3 BMEW sites were approaching 24 hours of daylight, and at those latitudes the sun does not climb. It circles the horizon, which means the radar faces, fixed and pointed low across the polar sky, were looking directly into it. Thule was aligned worst of all. The most active sun of the decade was sitting exactly where America's early warning system was looking. So why does the sun look like an enemy? Because a solar radio burst and a jamming attack produce the same thing at the receiver. Broadband noise, arriving at overwhelming power, drowning the return signal. There is no signature in the noise that says which one it is. This had happened once before. During the Second World War, British radar crews reported German jamming that turned out to be the sun. Nobody remembered. And one honest caveat: BMEWs operated at 440 MHz, and no instrument on Earth was measuring the sun at exactly that frequency that day. What the researchers established is that given the flux recorded on either side of it, extreme interference at 440 MHz is virtually certain. Inside the mountain, the answer came from a small unit almost nobody had heard of. Detachment 7 of the 4th Weather Wing, the Air Force's first solar forecasting office, stood up barely 2 years earlier and deliberately placed inside Cheyenne Mountain so the forecasters sat near the decision-makers. Colonel Charles Anderson commanded it. Major Donald Sherry and Captain Lee Snyder worked the problem, and the proof they assembled was not exotic. All 3 sites were in sunlight. The sun was radiating at record power, and as the solar flux began to fall, the jamming fell with it. In perfect step. No adversary on Earth turns a jammer down that smoothly. But that analysis took time, and while it was happening, Strategic Air Command was moving. Through most of the 1960s, roughly 1/3 of the entire American bomber force sat on alert at any given moment. SAC ran its alert posture as a ladder. Engines started, taxi to the runway and hold, and then launch. According to the study, commanders placed additional forces in ready-to-launch status. And this is the part of the story that should stay with you. Strategic Air Command's primary worldwide command link ran on high-frequency radio, between 6 and 30 megahertz. That is precisely the band the storm was destroying. Dayside radio propagation was collapsing across the sunlit hemisphere, the same propagation you need to stay in contact with aircraft in flight. SAC crews were trained to complete the mission unless they were clearly recalled.
Clearly.
So ask the uncomfortable question directly. If those bombers had launched, what would have been used to call them back? They did not launch. That is the documented outcome, and it needs saying plainly, because it is the part most retellings get wrong. No additional aircraft took off. The bombers were positioned to go, and they stayed on the ground. What we do not have is a minute-by-minute record of what happened at each individual base. Those accounts do not exist. The lead researcher's account describes some crews being sent as far as the runway. The published study is careful to say the base-level detail is missing, and so are we. 2 days later, the rest of the storm arrived. The geomagnetic disturbance of May 25th and 26th ranks 8th strongest on record. Aurora were visible over New Mexico, over Alabama, and overhead in Washington. Polar radio blackouts continued for more than a week. And there was one more thing in orbit that week. The Air Force had launched a then-classified accelerometer package the day before the flares. It lost more than 60 miles of altitude in 4 days. That instrument accidentally became the first detailed measurement of what an extreme solar storm does to satellites in orbit. The 1967 storm changed doctrine. Within months, the Air Force built out formal space environment forecasting, and that effort is the direct ancestor of the Space Weather Prediction Service the United States runs today. But it did not solve the problem. Operator, multiple inbound. Narrator, on the 15th of July, 2002, during a strong flare, a NORAD radar site confirmed it had painted multiple inbound targets. There was nothing there. The sun had done it again. 1967 was not the first time this network was fooled. 7 years earlier, the radar at Thule reported a massive Soviet missile launch that never happened. What it had actually detected was the moon rising over Norway. That story is next.